Thor, the god of thunder, could boast of many accomplishments, especially against the giants. By his powerful Mjolnir, many giants had died or been severely defeated. But just like how even the strongest oak can be felled by a storm, one of the most powerful, Aesir, and his brother Loki would eventually meet their match in the land of the giants. Feeling an itch for adventure, Thor's mind turned to the land of giants. Together with Loki, the duo set out in their goat chariots, riding until evening, when they found refuge in the house of a little peasant family consisting of the peasant, his wife, a son, and a daughter. For dinner, Thor slaughtered and cooked his 2 goats, but commanded that all bones be saved and placed on the goatskins. Now, the Mjolnir might be known as a powerful killer, but it also possessed the power to restore. In the morning, with just a touch of his hammer, the bones formed into Thor's 2 goats, seemingly alive and unharmed. But whole they were not, for one of the goats was now lame in one leg. While feasting, Thialfi, the peasant's son, had broken one of the thigh bones to get at the sweet marrow. As retribution, Thor took Thialfi and his sister, Roskva, as his servants. And what a good bargain it was, for Thialfi was the fastest man alive. At the fall of night, the 4 lodged in a queerly shaped house, whose entrance was as wide as the entire house itself. But they didn't sleep for long. At midnight, the earth shook with a terrible noise. Groping around the darkness, the 4 hid in a long, narrow chamber to the right until daylight. It was then they discovered an enormous sleeping giant, shaking the very ground with its snores. This was Skrymir the giant, and he volunteered to join them in their journey, and even carry their provisions for them. When evening came, they halted under a great oak tree, where Skrymir quickly fell into a nap, leaving Thor to struggle with the bag containing their food. Then the problem started. No matter how much he tried, the mighty god of thunder could not loosen even one knot of the giant's bag. Frustrated and embarrassed at Loki's snickering at his struggle, Thor hurled his hammer at the giant's forehead. But Skymir only stirred up lazily, thinking a leaf had fallen on his forehead. With no food to eat, no sleep came to Thor. All night, he lay awake, brooding in his embarrassment at how weak the giant's bag had made him seem. At midnight, Thor hurled his Mjolnir so hard at the crown of the giant's head that it created a depression. But Skrymir, half awake, half asleep, only murmured to himself that an acorn must have fallen on his head. Now Thor's embarrassment was doubled, and he decided to land one final blow. This time, the strike was so hard that the entire hammer sank into the temple of the giant. But alas, Skymir lazily woke up, and looking up at the oak tree, murmured to himself that a feather from one of the birds nesting there must have fallen on him. By now it was morning. A little humbled, Thor and his party journeyed east until they came upon a city so great they had to bend their necks backward to see the top of buildings. This was Utgard, the city of giants. With little dignity, they squeezed and wriggled between the bars of the giant gate until they found themselves inside. Entering a great hall, they found a gathering of the mightiest giants with their king sitting on a throne. Thor confidently strode over to the throne and politely greeted the king. But the king's reception wasn't as warm as expected. Contemplating them, he decided to test the travelers. He asked them to choose any feat they could accomplish better than anyone else. Loki went up first, and as always with a hidden agenda. He announced that he could eat faster than any man, for he was truly famished with hunger. And so the king called Loki from among his men to face Loki. A wooden trough full of meat was set between them, and the competition began. In his hunger, Loki devoured all the meat in his path, and at the center, the 2 met, seemingly matched in prowess. However, Loki the giant had not only eaten the meat, but also the bones, and even his half of the trough. The first defeat at Utgard had been dealt. Thialfi was up next and proclaimed he could run faster than any man. For their race, the king put forth Hugi. Out onto the plain they went, and the race kicked off. In their first race, Hugi won by such a wide margin that he went back to meet Thialfi. The second race was much closer, but still, Thialfi lost. For the third race, Thialfi put forth all his strength, truly speeding like the wind, but in vain. Hugi reached the finish line way before it was in Thialfi's sight. The second defeat at Utgard had been dealt. Now it was Thor's turn to redeem their honor. Thor declared that he could drink more mead than any of the king's men. At this uproarious laughter arose among the giants. A drinking horn was brought out. The king told Thor that the famous of the giants could clear the horn in one gulp. Many could clear it in two, but none was so weak as to not do it in three. Thor, used to even bigger vessels and presently very thirsty, raised the horn confidently to his lips and took a long draught, thinking he must have emptied it. Yet when he brought it down, the mead level had scarcely moved. Uproarious laughter and mockery rent the air, and Thor went for his second draught. One mighty gulp later, Thor set it down again. This time, the mead level was much lower, but still, a lot remained. The mockery grew in fervor. Now only one last try was left for Thor to prove himself as better than the least of the giants. This time he drank lustily for as long as he could, yet when he lowered the horn, several drops remained at the bottom. The third defeat at Utgard, graciously, the king offered him a different challenge. Thinking for a moment, the king told Thor that there was a stupid children's game that Thor could try his hand in. All he had to do was lift the cat off the ground. Thor agreed, then strode in a monstrous cat as tall as Thor, and with eyes of yellow fire. Not one to shy from a challenge, Thor seized the cat by its belly and tugged with all his might. Surprisingly, this effort only arched the cat's back and, at best, lifted one of its feet off the floor. Thor was stunned and sunk further in embarrassment. The fourth defeat and counting. Thor demanded a fresh challenge, this time his personal specialty, wrestling. The king again laughed and joked that none of his men would stoop so low as to wrestle a man as tiny as Thor. But for the sake of it, he'd let Thor wrestle with the king's old nurse, Ellie. Wrinkled, gray, and bent over, she came in. Planning to let go as soon as she screamed in pain, Thor took hold of Ellie, but the old hag seemed to only grow stronger the more Thor tried crushing her ribs. At her turn, the old woman attempted to trip up Thor and eventually brought him onto one knee. The fifth defeat had been dealt. With that, the king ordered that a feast be prepared for his guests. Despite all the merry around them, the travelers ate, drank, and slept very little that night. For great was their embarrassment. While escorting them out after breakfast the next morning, the king turned to Thor's company. Comforting them, he announced he had something to confess now that they were outside Utgard and would never be allowed to set foot in it again. It turned out that it was only by magic that Thor and his team had been beaten at every challenge. The giant Skrymir, whom Thor had encountered in the forest, was the king in disguise. Before he took a nap, he'd fastened his bag with invisible iron wires that couldn't be untied. As for surviving Thor's blows, the giant had slipped a hard rock under each of the 3 hammer strikes. Thor's brow began to darken with anger as the king continued. He admitted that while Loki was the hungriest fellow he'd ever seen, his opponent was fire itself. No wonder it had consumed everything in its path. Thialfi had not been racing a giant, but he had raced the embodiment of thought, which is faster than any action. What about the horn of mead? Well, the end of it was in the ocean, which no one could drain dry. Yet Thor's gulps had been so huge that the tide lowered it shore. As you might have already guessed, the cat too was no cat. It was the great Midgard serpent that encircled the whole world. Thor had in reality raised it so high it nearly touched the heavens, and the king confessed to the terror that gripped him when he saw one of the cat's feet lifted off the ground. And now to the most marvelous act of all, wrestling the old hag Ellie, who had been but age itself. For nothing that lives could ever defeat age, yet Thor had fared pretty well. With that, the king said it would be best if they didn't meet again. But by this point, Thor's anger had boiled over at the trickery he'd endured. He drew his hammer to strike the giant, but with his last trick, the king disappeared before his very own eyes. Worse, the city too had disappeared, and, in its place, only a desolate plain lay. The last defeat had been dealt. Well, all the party could do was troop back to Asgard. But magic or no magic, victory or defeat, the trio had achieved feats that no one had done before, and most likely no will ever. If you have enjoyed this video, make sure to smash the like button and subscribe for more content. It helps this channel reach more audience, which in return helps us create more videos for you guys. Don't forget to share and leave a comment too. Until next time, take care.